want to welcome you all to the afternoon session. This should be very exciting, the next 2 hours, and we start with a wonderful talk by Dr. Bevan Tandon, from Director of Clinical Molecular Diagnostics at MPN, and the title of his presentation today will be using LymphoTrack NGS clonality assays to identify T-cell receptor and immunoglobulin clonality and somatic hypermutation. Just a little background on our speaker today. He's a staff hematopathologist, Director of Clinical Molecular Diagnostics at a private reference laboratory in Eastern Tennessee. His laboratory provides, or the laboratory network provides, hematopathology and clinical molecular diagnostic services to client sites distributed throughout the southeastern United States. His subspecialty boarded in hematopathology and molecular genetic pathology. He completed hematopathology fellowships under the guidance of HWO lead author Stephen Swerdlow, and his molecular pathology fellowship was conducted at Washington University, St. Louis, where his training was primarily in genomics and pathology services. His interests are hematopathology and contemporary genomic studies relevant to clinical oncology. So before Dr. Bevan takes the days here, I'll just give a very quick introduction of In Vivo Scribe. We were started here at a poster session, I think in 1995, and we've been at this conference now, a participant, for over 20 years. This is our home, so we're very excited to be here. We also have additional workshops after this corporate workshop, another one at 3 o'clock in the same room, and then we have posters that you can go and view, I hope, during the poster sessions, and we also have a booth, obviously, for 19. So we've been around for over 20 years. We're 13485 compliant GMP manufacturer. We also run ISO 15189 laboratories around the world, in San Diego, in Germany, and also in Japan. We've also started a clinical service center in Shanghai, and we're starting to facilitate clinical trials there in China. We have offices in VivoScribe. We just moved into a 250% increased space in San Diego, corporate headquarters, and we also have an office in Provence, in La Ciotat. We've recently gotten a PMA approved, a companion diagnostic, with Novartis for their drug midostaurin for treating FLT3 positive AML. And so we have quite a lot of diagnostic and regulatory and quality experience. And these are just some of our capabilities. So we're also selling kits and bioinformatics software, which actually is free with the kits, to over 700 customers in over 100 countries around the world. And we're supporting dozens of clinical trials worldwide with over 145 enrollment sites. We actually have now over 150 NGS customers, so that's pretty exciting. We've seen a real uptake and surge in the use of our NGS assays and the associated bioinformatics software that goes with that. So I'll turn this speaking platform over to our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Miller, for the kind introduction. So in full disclosure, I serve as a staff hematopathologist, and I'm Director of Clinical Molecular Diagnostics at a private reference laboratory, Molecular Pathology Laboratory Network, Incorporated. So today, we will discuss utility of some of the LymphoTrack NGS assays that we've utilized in our laboratory to great effect. In the initial portion, I'll talk about LymphoTrack for clonality detection, which we have a poster here at the conference, in B-cell malignancies. I'll also then transition and discuss about our experience over the past year and more than 200 cases evaluated for IGHV somatic hypermutation status testing in our CLL/SLL patient population. And lastly, I will just very briefly touch on our validation and our experience with MRD testing using NGS LymphoTrack assays. But that will be covered to much greater detail in the subsequent workshop by Drs. Arcilla and Tam. So just a bit of background for orientation. Normal B cells, as you know, are key effectors in the humoral immune system and produce antibodies, which are key immune system components. They are polyclonal in healthy, normal people. In the setting of B-cell malignancy neoplasms, they are clonal. Broadly, we divide clonal B-cell malignancies into Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphomas, and in the U.S., annual incidence estimated approximately 172,000 new cases. The hematopoietic system broadly includes the bone marrow, where progenitor cells are resident and undergo subsequent differentiation steps. And then the peripheral tissue compartments include spleen and lymph nodes, and various components of these peripheral lymph node tissues in germinal center and marginal mantle zone, et cetera, can be expanded to give rise to the various neoplastic subsets related to different lymphoid compartments. And lymphoblastic lymphomas will arise from marrow lymphoblasts. So NGS for detection of lymphoid clonality, lymphoid malignancies characteristically harbor unique B-cell and T-cell receptor gene rearrangements. IgH and TCR loci consist of somatically rearranged VD and J rearranged region DNA segments distributed across chromosomes 14 and 7. I won't go into a full schematic representation of these events, but as you probably know, VDJ somatic recombination, junctional diversification, combinatorial joining of light and heavy chains, and somatic hypermutation all contribute to extreme diversity of the adaptive human immune repertoire with greater than 10 to the 12th possible IgH-TCR sequence combinations possible. So the point is, index rearranged lymphoid IgH and TCR gene sequences are extremely robust biomarkers for applications related to immune repertoire analysis, including clonality detection, IgHV testing, and MRD tracking. So in a polyclonal sample, you would expect, here's shown on right side, the PCR capillary electropherogram outputs based on fragment analysis. You'll see a range of amplification base pair length products showing this sort of nice Gaussian distribution. And when you look at NGS data, you'll see a range of IgH sequences. In oligoclonal samples, you might see several dominant peaks, and in a monoclonal PCR output, you'll see a single dominant peak typically, and then NGS read data correspondingly will show a predominance of a single IgH or TCR sequence. Challenges with the electropherogram or fragment analysis is sometimes, though, it's based on size separation. So you can have multiple IgH sequences. If they're the same length or the same size, they might underlie a clonal peak. And that's one of the aspects or utility of improvements in NGS for lymphoid clonality testing, for example. B-cell clonality, this is now related to a poster we have at the conference, so I hope that you'll be, we'll be delighted to take any questions if you stop by. But B-cell clonality testing is critical for routine hematopathology practice, particularly when morphology or other ancillary testing results are suspicious but not definitive for malignancy. And PCR is a current standard methodology widely employed by the vast majority of clinical testing laboratories. But like the LymphoTrack NGS assay, commercial NGS assays targeting IgH have only recently become available, and optimal testing approaches of incorporating NGS are not yet well established or standardized. So our laboratory, as I had mentioned, has utilized the in vivo scrap NGS LymphoTrack kit primers targeting IgH framework 1 for the past 12 months across 200 clinical cases, primarily for our CLL/SLL patient population for IgH somatic hypermutation testing. We've had a clonal detection rate of 99% of cases that are basically flow cytometry known clonal positive. So we've had very good results with IgH clonality detection in these known clonal samples. It's become of interest to us from a practical perspective in our laboratory recently to say, can we consolidate testing and utilize in vivo scribe IgH assays for not just somatic hypermutation testing, but B-cell clonality in general, and perhaps by sunsetting use of our ABI 310 genetic analyzer and fragment analysis, we can consolidate and streamline our laboratory workflows and potentially reduce operating costs. So we sought to assess the utility of expanding our IgH NGS testing in our laboratory to now also include B-cell clonality detection utilizing not just framework 1 primers, but also framework 2 and/or 3. So we looked at 36 bone, blood, marrow, or FFPE specimens previously tested by PCR, and they included a spectrum of B-cell malignancies, and also included were benign lymphoid reactive infiltrates. Our PCR assay employed in our laboratory has been used for 10 years and is based on specifications designed, espoused by Meyer et al. And basically, we perform our fragment analysis on an ABI 310, and then we define clonality as peaks that show a relative peak height ratio greater than 3. In our NGS assay for clonality, we used cutoffs of basically looking at, to account for biallelic rearrangements, a greater than 3-fold difference in variant allele fraction for IGH sequences that were, greater than 3-fold difference between the first and third most abundant IGH sequences. If you look at the literature, you'll see a variety of different sort of strategies, but this is the one that we used in this study. And sorry for large table display data, but basically showing here that in 36 cases tested, we had 32 out of 36 completely concordant results, but I'll show a little bit more detail about some of the discordant cases. And similarly, VJ utilization profiles for clonal cases were also found to be 100% similar between PCR and NGS testing. Two samples were positive by NGS and negative by PCR, and vice versa. 2 samples were negative by NGS and positive by PCR. So here was one case, and this was a epicardial lymph node with subtotal architectural effacement by a nodular B-cell infiltrate. We performed IGH clonality testing, and it was negative in this case. It was only tissue sampling, and no flow cytometry was performed. Here's the electropherogram output. These smaller base pair length products are the framework 3 PCR products, and here's framework 1. Basically, no clonal population detected by IGH PCR. We ran the NGS framework 3 assay, primer set in this case, and this is, you'll see throughout the talk like what the data display includes, but part of the beauty of the LymphoTrack assay is it's automated, non-subjective data display. And you get these spreadsheet outputs from the vendor-supplied bioinformatics software that shows the IGH sequences for every, IGH sequences for every IGH detected in the sample. You can get here relative fold change displayed between the first and third most abundant sequences. In this case, it was 4.75 approximately. Every single IGH sequence delineated gives its VJ utilization profile as well as its mutation rates and additional data points for each sequence in the analysis. So this case, again, was PCR polyclonal and NGS clonal. It wasn't a really dominant clone, but it was a 4.74 approximately clonality ratio. And in this case, on a subsequent flow cytometry analysis about 2 months later, in the supraclavicular lymph node biopsy, there was a monoclonal CD10 positive B-cell population compatible with involvement by a follicular lymphoma. So in my mind, the subsequent flow positive clonal study and corroborated essentially the NGS positive result, and PCR was essentially a false negative in this case. Here's another case from the our data set that showed IGH was, again, PCR polyclonal, and NGS was LymphoTrack framework 3 clonal. So shown here, again, is the framework 3 products, framework 1 products. You get this sort of Gaussian distribution for polyclonal amplification pattern. And here's the beta globin internal control peak, 352 base pairs, looks good. But in framework 3, you see these green bars is another way that the data is displayed in the software, showing these predominant 2 IGH sequences. Framework 1 was showing a variety of different IGH sequences, and this is what a polyclonal display will look like here. So clonality ratio in this case by the NGS analysis was 5.53, again in excess of 3, our cutoff. So I looked back and I wanted to also see more deeply what was this case. I will tell you, between my partners and I in clinical hematopathology practice, this was one of the most problematic cases of the year for us. It was a 67-year-old woman presenting with ocular proptosis, pretty dramatic presentation. She had a 2.8 centimeter mass compressing on the proximal to mid-optical nerve segment. Of course, as you know, lymphoid infiltrates in head and neck region predict for marginal zone lymphomas. And in this case, the clinical oncology was extremely suspicious, or they were expecting this was lymphoma. The PCR were IgH. I didn't show the Ig kappa. It was negative. Flow cytometry was negative. But on morphology on that case, we had a dense, it was again like a small limited sample. It was a dense B-cell infiltrate with focal kappa in situ hybridization staining excess in plasma cells. So in our minds, morphologically, we said this was a marginal zone lymphoma with plasmacytic differentiation until proven otherwise. But it was very problematic that none of our ancillary testing results were supportive of a malignant diagnosis. So at best, we could top line it as atypical lymphoplasmacytic infiltrate. I just wish that I had the NGS lymphotrack assay available to me in that particular case. But again, we did this, our NGS lymphotrack on archived FFPE specimens, which we had some sample remaining from this case. So NGS was clonal, and in this case, I believe the PCR and other ancillary testing results were negative, false negatives in this case. So conclusions, NGS is feasible for routine clinical testing. I should mention optimal combinations of IgH framework primers will require individual laboratory validation consistent with the literature. I haven't shown too much detail about this, but we did find, of course, that usage of framework 1, 2, and 3 primers improves clonality detection relative to individual primer sets. Interpretation of PCR results for lymphoid clonality detection is known to be subjective. I've been looking at these for over a few years, and I will tell you, and you have borderline cases, and the reason they sent you that case to begin with was because they're suspicious but not definitive. And so the molecular pathologist or sign-out attending is responsible for making a key determination that will push the diagnosis towards malignant or not. It's a lot of responsibility, and having a PCR output that's subjective or borderline, it's very, I don't like it in the clinical service, and the NGS data display, as I showed, is automated, non-subjective, digital, numerical, and it gets down to individual level nucleotide resolution and for individual nucleotide specificity, and so it's highly specific and easy to interpret. NGS consolidates laboratory workflow and instrumentation, and in our opinion will eliminate the necessity for our fragment analysis on an otherwise what is becoming an antiquated instrument in our laboratory. And the utility of NGS to assess clonal relatedness among lesions at disparate sites or evaluated for MRD at subsequent time points warrants for further investigation, but we'll have a subsequent workshop discussing MRD analysis. So our other poster at the presentation, at the conference, this is focused on LymphoTrack NGS for IGHV somatic hypermutation testing. And we'll be delighted to take any questions if you want to stop by. But CLL, as you know, is the most common leukemia diagnosed among adults in Western countries. Clinical outcomes in this disease are known to be heterogeneous, but IGHV somatic hypermutation status is one of only 5 essential baseline prognostic factors included in the CLL International Prognostic Index that have been found among the vast variety of different markers to be significant on multivariate analysis. Of course, as you know, this type of testing is not widely available. The conventional methodology approach is RT-PCR followed by Sanger sequencing, and it's cumbersome and performed by few laboratories. So what we do is broadly, for interpretation, we identify clonal sequences, and if they are less than 98% similar to reference control IgH, it is said to be mutated or hypermutated or corresponding to a favorable prognosis. If they are greater than 98 sequence similarity to reference controls, IgH sequences, it's unmutated disease and unfavorable prognosis. So we looked at 25 CLL SLL cases that were evaluated by both standard RT-PCR Sanger sequencing, and we used to send out to a national reference laboratory for this for many years. And then we brought in-house the LymphoTrack NGS assay, and we performed testing on using DNA from these archived samples previously tested by Sanger, and we performed testing on both the Illumina and PGM system platforms. So one thing I want to mention is of the 25 cases that we evaluated, 5 of those had been previously called no clonal population detected by the National Reference Laboratory. Now those are false negatives because these were known clonal CLL samples, flow cytometry confirmed, reflex to IGVH send-out analysis. NGS, when we, in our hands, demonstrated clonal results in all 25 of 25 cases evaluated. Among evaluable cases where Sanger sequencing did not fail to detect a clonal population, NGS demonstrated 100% concordance with IGH somatic hypermutation status. And in our hands, as opposed to a 20% limit of detection in using conventional Sanger sequencing, we have a limit of detection established at about 3%. So again, sorry for the table display, but I mean, basically I just want to draw attention to the fact that 25 cases evaluated. Looks like my pointer's getting a little, okay. Well, 5 out of the 25 cases showed no clonal population detected by Sanger, but Illumina and PGM sequencing showed concordant results. And importantly, one of those cases, actually, which I'll show in the subsequent slide, was V321 VJ utilization, which is a known adverse prognostic factor in CLL independent of the IGVH mutation status. And one thing that always impresses me about this assay also is looking at the mutation rates alone. Now, these were samples where basically 1-2 years prior, we had extracted RNA and sent out to the National Reference Laboratory. And of course, you get your mutation rate in the report. Now, we used on the archival samples in this study, we extracted DNA, and then we found the mutation rates were extremely closely correspondent between the sample analyses. Some of these were 1 or 2 year old specimens, but yet, you know, the Sanger sequencing result was 97.92 here, and it's 97.35 by both, down to, you know, 0.1 level percent correspondence between PGM and Illumina sequencing. So here was one of the cases, that V321 case, where Sanger sequencing PCR analysis failed to detect a clone and was reported as such by our send-out laboratory, but when we performed the in-house lymphotrack assay, NGS was informative and detected a V321 gene rearrangement, or gene utilization. So this was actually a kind of an especially egregious case to not detect a clonal population on, because it was a hyperleukocytosis, probably one of the highest I've seen, 302 overall white count, and in this case, IGHV mutation status was 100% unmutated, highly unfavorable in this setting and correspondent with the other disease features in the case. And V321 gene utilization was identified. And, you know, in addition to those other like spreadsheet outputs and the bar graph 3D, or I mean the line graph that we saw, the data display for the included with the assay output also includes these 3-dimensional bar graphs as well. Here's another case that was a decalcified bone biopsy in a 64-year-old male with 90% marrow involvement by CLL. FISH was technically limited because of decalcification. We had flow cytometry showed, you know, a CLL population, but it was a very basically, you know, limited cellularity analysis. But nevertheless, and again, the patient also had a 83,000 white count approximately. Our NGS lymphotrack assay did yield technically robust results with 100% sequence homology identified and a dominant clone as depicted here. Here was another case that clinically the patient had been followed for several years, and in the EMR it was listed as intermediate risk Rye stage 1 disease. This is a patient who had P53 and ATM loss by FISH. And our IGVH assay in this case demonstrated a dominant clonal population with 100% sequence homology indicative of unmutated disease, i.e. unfavorable. Now, I just want to mention that in the CLL IPI, that for prognostic risk stratification, the ultra-high risk category is those cases that have P53 loss by some methodology, whether sequencing or FISH, together with concurrent IGVH unmutated status. So in this case, the patient had been followed, no therapy administered, but, you know, they had ultra-high risk disease essentially uncovered by this assay. And they had, you know, until we brought this test in our laboratory, the patient hadn't had that test performed as a send-out. This was a low count. We sometimes also, in addition, in our laboratory, we have a reflex setup where if we have flow cytometry positive for CLL, we reflex and extract DNA and perform the lymphotrack assay. Sometimes, though, we get low count monoclonal B-cell lymphocytosis CLL precursor cases included in the analysis. And there was a nice paper from ARUP group and David Baylor showing how in MBL cases that were flow cell sorted and subjected to NGS analysis, they not infrequently show oligoclonal composition up to 20 to 25% of cases. In my experience, in the MBL cases that we've evaluated, the majority are sort of oligoclonal composition. And in this case, you can easily tell, this sort of biclonal with 2 dominant peaks identified. And lastly, this one was, again, I've tried to emphasize, the LymphoTrack NGS assay can utilize DNA as an acceptable specimen substrate. So traditional approach to this testing is RNA extraction followed by reverse transcription cDNA analysis and PCR amplification and Sanger sequencing. But using DNA in the NGS LymphoTrack assay, we don't have the requirement for 48-hour sample receipt by the performing laboratory. And so we had a case just the other week in our laboratory where the clinician had said, look, I have a tissue fragment in RPMI in the refrigerator. It's about 30 days old. The morphology shows CLL, SLL. Could you perform the IGVH status? And so, we've done DNA specimen stability studies in our laboratory, but I, of course, expect it's DNA-based testing. I expect to see robust results. And in this case, indeed, a 30-day-old sample sitting in the refrigerator in RPMI, we got, technically adequate hypermutated disease status identified using the NGS LymphoTrack assay. So it's been a huge boon to our service and a positive benefit. So in summary, regarding IGVH somatic hypermutation testing, to date, we have sequenced over 200 cases, and we've gone and reduced our failure rate based on the National Reference Laboratory send-out, had 20% failure to detect clonal populations. We've had 2 out of more than 200 cases tested where we had assay failure. So that's been a huge benefit to our laboratory. I should mention this is a very easy, from a hands-on perspective, assay to perform for library preparation. It's easily implemented. Hands-on time is less than 5 hours. It also facilitates batch multiplex testing where you're only limited by the number of barcodes in your sequencing. And most importantly, perhaps, we're a private reference laboratory in rural East Tennessee. It's a little difficult to recruit bioinformatics staffing to our region. So we really do rely on robust vendor-supplied bioinformatics solutions. And the software with this assay is very robust. And as I've shown, in some of these case discussions, the clinical analysis and reporting is very streamlined. And it's basically only a matter of minutes for me to go through my weekly case load. So use of DNA as an acceptable specimen substrate eliminates the necessity of rapid specimen receipt and facilitates add-on testing long after initial sample collection. It does demonstrate a more robust analytic sensitivity, 3% versus 20%, facilitating analysis in low-count CLL, SLL, and monoclonal B-cell lymphocytosis cases. And data output is non-subjective and automated, significantly streamlining interpretation and clinical reporting. I can't tell you what a benefit that last part is, having looked at the PCR electropherograms for the past several years. So the last part of my presentation here, I will not touch in too great a depth on this because it's going to be discussed in much greater detail by Drs. Arcilla and Tam. But minimal residual disease refers to the presence of leukemic cells below the thresholds of detection by conventional morphologic methods. In ALL, the NCCN guidelines contain language indicating a cutoff for clinical management as 10 to the minus 4. The International Myeloma Working Group consensus criteria also specifies a cutoff, and it's actually in there 1 times 10 to the minus 5, and a similar cutoff has language in the NCCN guidelines as well. I should mention now, sorry for the text, but minimal residual disease detection by flow cytometry demonstrates sensitivities generally ranging only between 10 to the minus 3rd and 10 to the minus 4. We get all of our acute leukemia from East Tennessee Children's Hospitals in our region for flow cytometry analysis sent to our laboratory. So I can speak from experience over the last several years that if I have a CSF sample that's low cellularity, especially, for example, asking, is there minimal residual disease present? Those flow cytometry calls are very subjective. And so my point is, when you get down to the lowest levels of detection, capability by flow, the data analysis is highly operator dependent and can be very subjective. And so as I've shown here, using NGS read data, that subjectivity in the analysis is effectively eliminated. Specificity of flow cytometry may be limited when leukemia-associated immunophenotypes overlap with those normal regenerative marrow precursors. It's a classic problem in hematopathology practice, residual BALL versus hematogone hyperplasia. In skilled hands, it's usually not an issue, but it can be very challenging. And flow cytometry data analysis, as I mentioned, can be subjective at the lowest levels of disease. Although PCR demonstrates greater sensitivity than flow, amplifiable gene signature translocations are typically only present in subsets of the disease. So an easy example is Philadelphia positive BALL. In adults, you only have the chimeric fusion transcript present in subsets of cases. Even among cases where you have a disease-defining translocation event, like in mantle cell lymphoma, where you have essentially 100% of the cases harbor IGH-CCND1 rearrangements, unfortunately, the variability in the breakpoints for CCND1 render PCR amenable to only 50% of cases approximately. The other issue then for PCR is people have thought, okay, how about targeting IGH for PCR analysis for MRD and B-cell malignancies? Well, one challenge has been that the necessity for patient-specific primer design is impractical for a lot of laboratories. So the workflow for NGS will include initially the B-cell clonality detection, followed by subsequent analysis, where you track the additional index leukemic IGH sequence identified on initial clonality, and then you look for it in subsequent analyses. A critical question that you have to factor in, though, is if you want to get down to the lowest levels of residual disease detection, you have to increase your sample input requirements. So to achieve a 1 in 10 to the 5th detection limit with about 95% confidence, it's recommended to include about 3 micrograms of DNA. So here's one case from our validation of a 62-year-old male with CLL. The peripheral blood flow cytometry in this case was actually a little bit interesting, that there was clonal subsets. There was kappa and lambda monoclonal subsets noted, depending on where you gated for 20. So the point is, even flow cytometry was indicative or suggestive of biclonal or oligoclonal sample composition. And when we did the NGS clonality testing on this case, we find that there's a variety of predominant IGH sequences, so sort of compatible with oligoclonal sample composition. So in our serial dilution study, we took blood from this particular CLL patient and diluted it into wild type. We tracked the top 5 predominant clonal IGH sequences with allelic fractions greater than 1%. We performed triplicate dilutions range from 10 to the minus 2 to the 10 to the minus 6 range, and evaluated the NGS data output with expected clonal frequencies. No clonal sequences were detected below 10 to the minus 7, but basically, we had decent linearity across triplicate specimen dilutions from 10 to the minus 3 to the 10 to the minus 4. Between 10 to the minus 5 and 10 to the minus 6, we started seeing some dropout in expected data points. So we basically, in our validation, established a limit of quantitation of 1 times 10 to the minus 5 with 95% confidence, limit of detection of 1 times 10 to the minus 6. And we did detect IGH sequences, clonotypic sequences down to as low as 10 to the minus 7 range, but those were variable. So I'm about to wrap up in the last few slides, but my colleague, Dr. Caleb Ho, and also with the permission of Dr. Arcilla, I'm displaying some data from a study that they had presented at last year's AMP meeting. This actually was conferred the Distinction of Young Investigator Award at last year's meeting, and Dr. Arcilla will expound on this to much greater detail in her talk. But here was a case that from Memorial Sloan Kettering of a patient with T lymphoblastic leukemia lymphoma. The patient relapsed and underwent a second stem cell transplantation. So in the relapse specimen, I hope my pointer will work a little, okay. In the relapse specimen, there's basically 2 predominant TCR gene rearranged sequences. They corresponded to 148 and 144 base pair length TCR sequences, and PCR showed this sort of like biclonal pattern here. 1 month after the second stem cell transplantation, one of the points to make here is compare the PCR data on this 1 month post-second transplant to the original, and it's very difficult to discern residual disease looking at these, looking and assessing for clonal relatedness or identity between peaks. But the NGS read data being, or the nature of it is such that it's very easy to discern clonotypic sequences presence or absence. And you can see here on this example, this was the, what was the predominant 148 base pair sequence shown here, and it was present at 0.02 approximately percent fraction. 6 months post second stem cell transplantation, the other 144 base pair length sequence was identified at about 0.02%. Again, looking at the PCR data, it's very difficult to discern the presence of that similar population. And 8 months post second stem cell transplantation, here's PCR. It's kind of noisy pattern, and patient was morphologic remission, and flow cytometry was also negative, but NGS demonstrated the presence of both of those initial index clonotypic sequences. And those were identified at 0.05 and 0.01% of total IGH sequences. So here's just a superficial, partial display of the case data, and I'll just draw your attention to the green bars that in almost all cases evaluated essentially, NGS LymphoTrack demonstrated the presence of residual disease where other assays like flow did not detect residual disease. So in summary, LymphoTrack assays targeting IGH and TCR represent an end-to-end commercial NGS solution that conferred significant advantages over traditional approaches. LymphoTrack NGS represents an attractive solution for platform consolidation in the routine clinical laboratory setting and eliminates reliance on traditional PCR amplification followed by fragment analysis for lymphoid clonality testing. LymphoTrack NGS vendor-supplied bioinformatics software is highly robust and sufficient for clinical reporting, and that, as I try to emphasize, is a major benefit of the assay for our practice setting where we don't have on-site bioinformatics staffing support. LymphoTrack NGS data output is automated and non-subjective and significantly enhances clinical interpretation for lymphoid clonality assessment, in my opinion. LymphoTrack NGS testing confers significant practical and technical advantages for CLL, SLL. So looking at our case experience in rural East Tennessee, among 200 cases that we've evaluated, the assay failure rate has been reduced from 20% at the National Send-Out Laboratory to 1% for detection of clonal populations. DNA specimen analysis, it eliminates complications related to RNA lability, and as I tried to show in the case examples, facilitates add-on testing for samples stored at extended timer intervals, and it eliminates essentially the necessity for rapid sample transit and specimen receipt. From wet bench to clinical reporting, laboratory workflow is streamlined. Batch multiplex testing using the NGS assay reduces operating costs and streamlines laboratory workflow. The analytic sensitivity is improved with the NGS LymphoTrack assay versus traditional Sanger sequencing. In our hands, it's 3% versus 20%. And regarding the LymphoTrack NGS MRD, the analytic sensitivity is an order of magnitude greater than standard flow cytometry, and in my opinion, significantly improves upon classical methodologies. So with that, I would like to thank you all for providing your time and attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions.